So we have been tracking through some of the really important moments in the life of Moses. And now we're here at Mount Sinai. And this is kind of the big deal. This is the really important part. And in fact, there are so many chapters and verses really in the first 5 books of the Bible that center on what happens at Mount Sinai that you get the sense that everything else was kind of preamble up to this point. And I think as we talk about it, you'll see why that is. This is where God makes Israel Israel. He redeems and rescues his people out of slavery, but it is here at Mount Sinai that they come to an agreement or they make a covenant with each other. This is where their nation is founded. So if we back up a little bit, this is God speaking to Moses. He says, "Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So the point of God selecting this family Israel is not so that they could be some weird Canaanite God club that is insulated and isolated from everyone else, and they'll just be off over here being all righteous all the time, because that's kind of obnoxious. That's not what God has in mind. In fact, he's saying you guys are going to demonstrate what it means for the Creator God to be in charge. Your lives will be patterned after what I desire, so that the rest of the nations will look at you and say, essentially, I got to get me some of that. They will be the light to the Gentiles, a kingdom of priests who kind of bring God to the rest of the world. So in order to understand this, though, we've got to back up a little bit further. So I said a couple weeks ago that in order to really get at what's happening in Exodus, we have to go back to the beginning of Genesis. This is when God creates the world, and as we've been talking about, and this is kind of like a drum that I like to beat, God creates the world in such a way that he wants it to be the place where he dwells. That's part of what it means when it says that on the seventh day God rests. It doesn't mean that he's relaxing. It's this is how a God takes up residence, moves into the neighborhood kind of thing. And he gets a little more specific. See, he created as kind of the pinnacle of his creation human beings, and we bear God's image, which means that we are God's representatives, his ambassadors, his vice regents. And as we interact with and cultivate creation, we reflect the grace and wisdom of God. And he cultivates this garden, Eden, this extremely sacred space. And the writer of Genesis explains that this is where God is. This is where he dwells. And in perfect harmony with human beings. But then, of course, there's a problem. When these human beings, this man and this woman, grab from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as we've been talking about, that is them grabbing or defining wisdom for themselves. They decide what's going to be right or wrong or wise or unwise apart from God. And human misery is nothing if not us deciding wisdom for ourselves apart from God. And when that happens, everything fractures. God's representatives no longer represent him. And so his presence departs and no longer dwells on earth. The man and the woman get booted from the garden because that's where the tree of life is. And it's not really spoken, but there then comes this question that is always going to be underneath the surface throughout the entirety of the rest of the Bible, which is, how does God return to his creation? And what does that look like? And so at some point, God selects like this family. Starts with Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob. Jacob gets renamed to Israel. And there's this promise, like through you, the nations will be blessed. And then kind of just underneath the surface, through your family, I will return to my creation. But the question is then, how? Well, here is where we get this sense that God is about to really start doing in a very tangible way what we've kind of been waiting for him to do. So the Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. Notice that. The Lord descends to the top of Mount Sinai. His presence comes back. Even if not permanently, it's starting. And Moses comes to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, "Go down and warn the people so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them." So there's something terrifying, really, about the tangible presence of God. And you can't see it quite as easily here. You could if we kind of parse things out. You see it more obviously in a couple of chapters. So if you don't take my word for it, you can just look it up. But you have here God descending to the top of Mount Sinai, and that's where Moses is. That's called being a high priest. And then, like somewhere, not at the top of the mountain, but kind of lower down, that's where the priests, Aaron and the rest of the priests, are allowed to hang out because they've got the training. They know how to consecrate themselves to prepare for the presence of God. And then at the bottom of the mountain, that's where kind of everyone else is, the schlubs like you and me, because we don't know what's going on. And God is first off warning them, like, make sure nobody who's unprepared comes into my presence, because if you do, it'll be like a face-melting presence of God, like Indiana Jones, and the Nazis' faces melt off or something like that. Now, we have the high priest at the top who is allowed to be in the very presence of God. We have the priests who kind of know what's going on, are allowed to go into like a holy place, but not the most holy place. And then at the bottom is kind of everybody else. Because theologians love to come up with complicated words, this is called a tripartite division. Because, three, part, ite, because English doesn't make sense and we tack things on to ends of words. This three-part structure occurs in two other structures, the tabernacle and the temple, the places where God actually dwells among his people. Mount Sinai is the beginning of God's manifest, tangible presence returning to the earth. Now, in 2 weeks, we'll hear more about Moses and the tabernacle. But for now, this is God finally starting to reinvade his creation. So then that raises this question like, okay, so what is that going to look like? We should see the Ten Commandments in that light. God has already redeemed his Israelites. It's not as though the Israelites have to follow all of these commandments perfectly, and if they do, then they will be God's people. No, he redeems them and rescues them first. But now what he's saying is that, okay, now that you are my people and I am your God, this is what it's going to look like for me to be in charge. Now, to be fair, for the Israelites, they hear this and then they follow these laws for like 30 seconds, and then it just kind of falls apart from there. But I want to stick with these 10 commandments and kind of talk through them a little bit, because they really do give an indication of, what does it look like if God were really king here? Now, fair warning, if you're really familiar with the Ten Commandments and Bible study and all of that, there are at least 3 different ways to count or number the 10 Commandments. There's kind of like a Reformed and Baptist way, there's like a Lutheran and Roman Catholic way, and then there's a Jewish way. Unfortunately, I went to the largest Baptist university as an undergrad. I did my Lutheran training at a Lutheran seminary, obviously, and my research interests are like first century Judaism. So I have given up on trying to figure out which is which. One revision of these slides had like 12 commandments because I couldn't remember. So if this doesn't jive with what you remember in catechism, we're just gonna go with it. So just covering that. All right, so he starts with, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, or out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So first off, first commandment, look, I am your God. I am the creator, which means also I redeem, I rescue. That's just the thing that I do. So what does it look like for me to be in charge? Well, you worship me. That's a good person to worship. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. Now, this does not mean that God gets really upset at people playing with dolls or something like that. But in this culture, the people couldn't really differentiate between like a statue and a god. Like they worship the statues because those statues for them are the images of the god. Notice the connection there. Humans are made in the image of God. The idols are made in the image of a god. There's a deep connection there. And so what he's saying is like, don't worship anything other than me. Now, this, by the way, is Israel's first great sin. They break this one like in 30 seconds, and you'll hear more about that next week. But this applies to us too. I mean, I don't feel compelled to like worship Barbie, but I am very good, and so are you, that's part of being human, at finding all kinds of other things to worship. So I would ask you the question of, where do you look for your security? Money is a big one. You know, if I just have enough money, my bank account is doing this, I make enough per year, then I will be okay. Well, that's well on your way to worshiping the idol of money or power, authority, influence. Everything would be okay if only things would operate how I want them to operate because I know how things should operate. Do you recognize yourself in that? And I want to see nobody throwing elbows at the people around them because that person could well be you. It's an easy thing to worship, this power. If only the right politicians were in power, then I'd be okay. And I wouldn't have to worry. Well, that's an idol. We are excellent at forming idols. They just don't look like they used to. But if we only worshiped the true creator God, man, life would be good. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. So this does not mean be careful of what you say when you stub your toe. This is saying more that the name of God is sacred and it is powerful. Don't use it flippantly, because this is the creator we're talking about. For example, we have stamped on the thing that we tend to worship as God, the phrase, "in God we trust." I'm uncomfortable with that, to be honest. And in fact, the name of God was so sacred that eventually, about 200-ish years before Jesus hits the scene, that they stopped pronouncing the divine name at all. Yahweh is just the consonants. We don't actually know how his name was pronounced. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. There is something about the rhythm of creation that 6 days on, 1 day off is really, really healthy. Excuse me. And not only, though, is this just about like taking a break every 6 days. I mean, that's part of the Sabbath, but embedded deeply into the Sabbath is the wisdom that the world around you is not going to collapse if you step away for a day. I mean, we tend to work frantically, and we've always got to be on our emails and check all this stuff and make sure that we're taking care of everything. And deep down, I think it's because we forget that, God's really in charge. He watches over his creation. There is nothing that will fall apart if we don't intervene constantly and every day. Or to put it a little more bluntly, you're not that important. Enjoy the freedom that comes with that. Honor your father and mother. Now, this is tricky, because what if mom and dad were terrible? And actually, though, Martin Luther extends this out, and I think it's a really, really good point that this is, it's about your parents, but this is about honoring authority in general. And think about it, because what we're really asking is, what would it look like if God were in charge? Assuming that the government and authorities are relatively sane. And we here in the U.S. are very fortunate compared to other countries. How would it be if everyone just kind of did what they're supposed to do and they didn't do anything illegal? That would be really, really nice. It would be easier and safer to drive. There would be a whole lot less to worry about. We would be a lot more secure. People wouldn't be breaking all kinds of financial laws and wrecking markets and stuff like that. It would really, really make life easier if we all just kind of did what we were supposed to. You shall not murder. Sometimes this is translated, you shall not kill, and I disagree with that translation. In Hebrew, it's ratzach, or ratzach. It's hard to say with a cough. But murder is a good word for this. Sometimes it can be used in the context of an assassination or a premeditated thing. But it's basically like a very unjust killing. And I realize that kind of devolves into all sorts of ethical questions that we can't really answer here. But, okay, first off, don't murder. I have never murdered anybody. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. I'm hoping that that's true of most of us, and if it's not, there's always grace and forgiveness. But Jesus makes this even harder, because, you've never murdered anybody, but have you ever been angry with somebody and just kind of held on to it? Yeah. I do that every hour of every day. And Jesus would say, therefore, you are guilty of murder. So, what would a society look like if we took this so seriously that we refuse to allow ourselves to hang on to that anger or that hatred, and instead constantly practice forgiveness and releasing that? And so instead of murdering in our minds, or literally or whatever, we would say, you know what, that person hurt me and they've got their own thing. I'm choosing to forgive them because I do not want to be guilty of harboring a kind of murderous resentment. Life would be amazing if we did that. That's what it looks like if God were in charge. You shall not commit adultery. There's something about family units that when family units are cohesive and functioning well, society just kind of does better. And God, as he ordained marriage, that's like a bond that should not be broken. And that doesn't mean that if it's broken, it can't be remended. There's always grace. But this is acknowledging that maybe sexual ethics are really important, and family units are really important. And that's something we as followers of Jesus ought to really, really value. And if we did, life would be a lot less complicated. Frankly, my job as a pastor would be a lot less complicated. You shall not steal. Now, I'm kind of a nervous sort. I've never stolen anything as far as I remember, because it would just freak me out. I would get really paranoid. But what if instead of just stealing things, I think that's what I'm trying to say, what if we also made sure never to defraud, Never to work out a deal so that very secretly I'm getting everything and what I'm doing is really shady and really unethical and I'm kind of coming around the back. Is it stealing? It could be. It might not. I don't know. But what if, like on the other side of this, we sought to really value the things that other people have? And we were going to honor those possessions and honor what people have worked toward. Life would be amazing. Shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. I hate gossip. Gossip murders churches. I've seen it happen a lot in every church I've been a part of. But what if instead of talking behind people's backs and lying to people and kind of assassinating character and all of that, we said, you know what? I am always going to speak the truth. I'm also going to be nice about it, because sometimes when we speak the truth, we're using that as an excuse to be a jerk. But what if, like, I'm always going to try and speak the truth to you? I'm never going to talk behind your back. And in fact, when I talk about you behind your back, I'm only going to say the things that really impress me about you. How would life change? Or even better, like if I see something happening and it seems like you're doing something crazy, like imagine somebody like just speeding down the 55, instead of saying, that guy's crazy, that's awful, what are they doing, this is terrible, what if instead you put the best construction on things and said, you know what, I'm willing to assume that something is very important, so important that they need to put themselves in danger. Now, it doesn't work all the time, but if you are willing to reinterpret everybody's actions in the best possible light, life would be amazing. Then you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant. And by the way, if you have servants, I think we should probably talk about that. His ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor, including his Tesla, because they seem really cool. Coveting is a very effective way at just sucking the joy out of everything that God has given you. And it also poisons relationships. Like if I'm extremely envious or if I'm coveting some of the things you have, my friendship or relationship with you will also suffer. But if we didn't, and we just honored what people had, and we're like, man, God has blessed you, and that's awesome, life would be so good. So as God lays out through Moses, like, this is what it means for me to be in charge, I think we can all agree that if we follow these laws, it would be awesome. But we can't. And going through these 10 commandments, and I've done this is my third time now this weekend doing it, there's always this point where it starts to get kind of quiet. Because the problem isn't just that we can't, the problem is that I can't. So even though God redeems and rescues his people Israel from slavery to Egypt, and as it turns out, kind of slavery to themselves, and he says, therefore, this is how you live, this is what it means to be in charge, the law also has this uncomfortable ability to show us that we do not measure up. It would be amazing if we lived like that, but we don't. Because, at least for now, we can't. And that is supremely painful. Well, as I mentioned, like the whole Bible is about how does God's presence return to earth. And there's the tabernacle, and then there's the temple. And then there's this huge plot twist that people really didn't see coming at that moment, that God comes as his son. This is divinity walking around in flesh. And when Jesus hits the scene, you get this sense that everything is about to change. Now look at what the author of Hebrews says. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, think about that. This is not ascending into heaven like I'm floating off to the clouds like what we sort of think. That's not what he's talking about. This is the language of Mount Sinai. Moses was the high priest, and he ascended the mountain to where God is. Jesus is the great high priest who ascends to heaven, which is by definition where God is. Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Jesus takes on this mantle of God's law. And as our high priest, he offers the sacrifice for our sin and our brokenness, only it's not an animal, it's himself. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence at the top of Mount Sinai, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. There will come a day, according to the Bible, when we live by those big 10, when God recreates and resurrects and restores, but it is not yet. And until then, we are constantly growing in this grace of God, learning more and more what it means to follow God's law and live as though he is truly in charge, because he is. But we also live with that brokenness. I do not measure up. I cannot keep these laws. But what the author of Hebrews is saying, because of Jesus, this high priest like Moses, that when we stand before God in this cosmic law court with the indictments of the law against us, the metaphorical gavel will hit the bench and we will be pronounced not guilty. Let's pray.